It was 6:15 on a freezing Monday morning in February when Vicky Sterling planted herself in my path, arms flung out wide like she was directing rush-hour traffic. And in that moment, I knew my quiet life at Willowbrook Estates had just crashed to a fiery end. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped a violation notice as hefty as a master's thesis, her eyes sparkling with the smug glee of someone who'd just hit the jackpot in their own backyard. Standing there in my wrinkled clothes, utterly drained, I couldn't have guessed that 3 months later, this same spot would see Vicky in handcuffs, with responding officers doubled over, laughing like they'd scored front-row seats to a comedy goldmine, a poetic justice I'll never forget. But before we dive into that glorious scene, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm dying to see how far this insane HOA drama has spread online. Buckle up, because this wild ride is too unreal to be fiction, and you won't want to miss a second of it. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA. We will narrate your story on our channel. I just returned from what felt like the longest 10 days of my entire life, staying by my mother's bedside at Grady Memorial Hospital after she'd suffered a severe stroke that had completely changed our family's world in an instant. The last thing I expected upon returning to what I thought was the sanctuary of my own neighborhood was a welcoming committee, especially one that came armed with official paperwork and what appeared to be a professional photographer. Yes, you heard that absolutely correctly. Vicky had actually brought someone to document this early morning confrontation, like she was conducting some kind of serious criminal investigation, rather than harassing a neighbor who just spent over a week watching his mother fight for her life in intensive care. The violation notice that she thrust aggressively through my car window with theatrical precision was for something called unauthorized extended absence without notification, which was apparently a brand new rule that had been passed with remarkable timing, while I was literally holding my mother's hand in the ICU and praying she would survive her medical crisis. The timing of this new regulation wasn't coincidental in any way, as I would soon discover through my own investigation into Vicky Sterling's increasingly authoritarian methods of neighborhood control. "Mr. Harrington," Vicky announced with the kind of manufactured authority that someone develops when they've appointed themselves the unofficial queen of suburban America, "you have clearly and deliberately violated Section 12.44 of our newly updated and strictly enforced community standards. Extended absences of more than 7 consecutive days require written notification to the HOA board at least 48 hours in advance. And this requirement is She paused dramatically for maximum effect, clearly savoring every moment of this carefully orchestrated confrontation. "Since you have completely failed to comply with these established procedures, you are now subject to immediate penalties and what we call enhanced monitoring of your future activities." The photographer continued snapping away methodically while Vicky opened her expensive laptop right there on the public street, printing out additional documentation like she was operating some kind of mobile violation factory designed specifically for maximum intimidation. Here's the thing that made this entire ridiculous situation particularly ironic and almost comedic in its absurdity. I'm Elliot Harrington, and I make my living as a professional governance consultant for nonprofit organizations across the southeastern United States. I literally spend my days helping communities resolve complex disputes and fix their broken administrative systems for a living. I understand HOA law significantly better than most board members understand their own bylaws, and I've seen every trick in the book when it comes to petty authoritarians who abuse their limited power. But standing there at 6:15 in the morning, completely exhausted from 10 days of hospital visits and worried sick about my mother's uncertain recovery, I made what I thought was a conscious and mature decision to keep the peace rather than escalate an already tense situation. I was already dealing with enough overwhelming stress without adding a full-scale neighborhood war to my already overflowing plate of responsibilities. "I completely understand your position, Mrs. Sterling," I replied, as calmly as I could manage, accepting the official-looking violation notice without any argument or resistance. I was entirely focused on my mother's medical emergency and honestly didn't think to notify the board about my absence. I'll absolutely make sure to follow all proper procedures going forward to avoid any future misunderstandings. I genuinely thought this reasonable and diplomatic response would diffuse the obviously tense situation, but the cold smile that slowly spread across Vicky's face told me I had just made a significant tactical error in judgment. In her calculating mind, my polite compliance wasn't an act of good neighborly politeness. It was a clear sign of weakness and submission. And weakness, as I would very quickly learn through painful experience, was something that Vicky Sterling had spent years learning how to identify and ruthlessly exploit for her own benefit. As I slowly drove toward my house through the winding streets of our normally peaceful subdivision, I couldn't shake the increasingly uncomfortable feeling that this morning's encounter was far less about legitimate rule enforcement and much more about establishing dominance and control over someone she perceived as a threat to her authority. The professional photographer, the elaborate mobile printing setup, the theatrical presentation of official documents. It all felt like carefully choreographed theater, designed to intimidate and humiliate rather than actually address any genuine community concerns. But the most deeply unsettling part of the entire encounter was Vicky's chilling parting comment as I drove away toward my house. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Harrington." The way she said those words with that predatory smile and the unmistakable gleam of anticipation in her eyes made it crystal clear that my 10-day absence had somehow painted a bright red target squarely on my back. What I didn't know yet, but would discover through careful investigation over the following weeks, was that Vicky Sterling had spent those exact 10 days that I was at the hospital carefully orchestrating what she clearly saw as my inevitable downfall and removal from the community. She'd called multiple emergency board meetings during my absence, pushed through several new regulations specifically designed to target my situation, and methodically laid the groundwork for what she confidently believed would be a swift and decisive victory in her personal war against what she perceived as my challenge to her absolute authority. In her twisted mind, I was just another troublesome obstacle to be systematically removed from her perfectly controlled little kingdom, where she ruled with an iron fist. But here's what Vicky Sterling didn't know about me and my background. While I might genuinely prefer peaceful and diplomatic solutions to conflicts, when someone pushes me into a corner and threatens everything I care about, I don't just push back with equal force. I completely and strategically changed the entire game to my advantage. Over the next 3 increasingly frustrating weeks, my poor mailbox became what I can only describe as Vicky's personal violation distribution center, operating with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed specifically for harassment. Every other day, without fail, brought a new elaborate infraction notice, each one more completely ridiculous and petty than the last, as if she was competing with herself to see how absurd she could make these alleged violations while still maintaining some thin veneer of official legitimacy. First came the infamous mailbox polish violation, where she claimed that our brass mailboxes required weekly polishing according to some obscure subsection of the community aesthetic standards, and mine had apparently gone 72 hours without proper maintenance, which she documented with time-stamped photographs taken from multiple angles. Then there was what she dramatically called the garage door incident, where I'd committed the heinous crime of leaving my garage door open for 31 minutes while I sorted through my mother's personal belongings to bring to her rehabilitation facility, which allegedly violated the 30-minute maximum open-door policy that had been mysteriously implemented during my absence and applied retroactively to my situation. But the absolute crown jewel of complete absurdity was the lawnmower noise violation that demonstrated just how far Vicky was willing to go to harass me into submission. I had started mowing my lawn at 8:01 in the morning, exactly 1 minute after the designated start time that had been established by the HOA board. But Vicky claimed that her sophisticated noise monitoring equipment had detected what she called engine ignition preparation sounds at 7:58 in the morning. According to her completely twisted interpretation of the rules, simply starting the mower engine constituted a noise violation, regardless of when the actual mowing began or whether any neighbors were actually disturbed by the brief sound. Each violation came with professional quality photographs, precise timestamps, detailed noise level measurements, and enough official documentation to successfully prosecute a federal case in court. That's when Diane Peterson entered the picture like a guardian angel, appearing at my front door one evening with a warm casserole and what appeared to be a genuinely sympathetic smile. "I've been watching what Vicky's been systematically doing to you," she said, with apparent concern, settling into my kitchen like we were old friends who had known each other for years. "The woman has completely lost her mind since her real estate empire collapsed in that big scandal a few years ago. She treats this HOA presidency like she's running a Fortune 500 company instead of managing a simple neighborhood association." Dan was attractive in that perfectly polished suburban way that suggested serious money and time for self-care, with expertly styled blonde hair and expensive athleisure wear that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. "The trick with dealing with Vicky," Diane continued confidentially, picking at her perfectly manicured nails while choosing her words carefully, "is understanding that she operates entirely on power dynamics and psychological intimidation tactics. She's basically testing you right now, carefully measuring how much harassment and abuse you'll tolerate before you finally decide to fight back against her authority. If you play this situation smart and strategically, you can probably get her to back off without creating too much unnecessary drama for the entire community." Her advice seemed reasonable and well-informed, and frankly, I was genuinely grateful to finally have someone who seemed to understand the complex local dynamics and Vicky's psychological patterns. Diane claimed to have lived in Willowbrook for 8 years and seemed to know everyone's personal history, including details about past conflicts and how they were resolved. My first official HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and I approached it with what I genuinely believed was a diplomatic and reasonable mindset. I had spent hours preparing detailed talking points about reasonable accommodation policies for family medical emergencies and had drafted proposed amendments to make the community rules more practical and compassionate for working residents who might face unexpected life challenges. I genuinely believed that open communication, good faith discussion, and rational compromise could resolve our growing differences in a way that would benefit everyone involved. Looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, this might have been the most naive and foolish assumption I had ever made in my entire adult life. The meeting was held in the community center, a building that Vicky had somehow managed to transform into her own personal courtroom, where she could hold proceedings like some kind of judicial authority. She positioned herself at the head of a long conference table like a Supreme Court judge presiding over a criminal trial, with other board members strategically flanked on either side to create an intimidating presence. About 40 residents filled the folding chairs that had been arranged in neat rows, and I noticed with growing concern that several people were actively avoiding eye contact with me, like I was carrying some kind of contagious disease. Vicky had clearly been very busy spreading her carefully crafted version of events during my 10-day absence, painting me as the villain in her narrative. "Before we begin tonight's official agenda," Vicky announced in a voice that carried the practiced authority of someone who had grown accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I think it's critically important that we address the ongoing and escalating compliance issues with one of our residents who seems to believe the rules don't apply to him." She opened an impressively thick binder with dramatic flair and began reading what she grandly called my comprehensive violation history, which consisted of 17 meticulously documented pages of alleged infractions spanning just 3 weeks. Each violation was read aloud with clinical precision and prosecutorial zeal, accompanied by exact timestamps, detailed photographic evidence, and elaborate analysis of how my supposedly criminal actions threatened the sacred community standards that everyone else managed to follow without difficulty. The public humiliation was methodical, thorough, and clearly designed to destroy my reputation in front of the entire community. By the time Vicky finished her lengthy and damning presentation, I felt like a serial offender rather than someone who had simply been caring for his critically ill mother during a family medical crisis. But here's where I made my first major tactical error that would haunt me for weeks to come. Instead of gracefully accepting the criticism and humbly apologizing for any inconvenience I might have caused, I decided to fight back using legal technicalities and procedural arguments. I challenged the validity of rules that had been passed without proper notice to affected residents, questioned the legal authority to implement retroactive penalties for actions that weren't violations when they occurred, and pointed out numerous procedural violations in how the violations themselves had been issued and documented. My carefully researched legal defense was technically correct and would have held up in any real court, but it proved to be socially disastrous in this context. To the other residents who were watching this drama unfold, I didn't sound like someone reasonably defending himself against unfair treatment. I sounded like an arrogant newcomer who thought he was significantly smarter than everyone else and believed he could lawyer his way out of following the same rules that applied to every other resident. Vicky had expertly maneuvered me into looking like the entitled problem, and my defensive response only reinforced that carefully crafted perception. The meeting ended with several long-time residents openly expressing strong support for Vicky's firm leadership and making pointed suggestions that maybe I would be more comfortable in a less structured community where I could do whatever I wanted, without regard for my neighbors. Driving home through the quiet streets that night, feeling defeated and isolated, I called my mother at the rehabilitation center, where she was slowly recovering from her stroke. Despite her speech still being significantly affected by the brain damage, she managed to give me the best and most valuable advice I'd received in weeks. "Pick your battles carefully, son. Some fights simply aren't worth winning if they end up costing you everything else that matter." But as I pulled into my driveway and saw Diane waiting on my front porch with another concerned expression and what appeared to be a bottle of wine, I realized with growing clarity that Vicky Sterling had already chosen this particular battle for me. The only remaining question was whether I would have the wisdom and strategic thinking necessary to fight it the right way. Few days after what I could only describe as the completely disastrous HOA meeting, Vicky unveiled what she dramatically called her nuclear option. With all the fanfare of a military general announcing a major offensive campaign, she proposed an emergency community assessment of $2,500 per household to address what she claimed were critical drainage issues that somehow only affected the specific section of the neighborhood where I happened to live. The timing was absolutely perfect from her strategic perspective, positioned as an urgent infrastructure need that required immediate action to prevent serious property damage. Of course, these mysterious drainage problems had appeared with remarkable timing right after our public confrontation, and the proposed solution involved extensive and expensive work on properties that were conveniently adjacent to mine. I spent the entire weekend diving deep into research about the legal basis for emergency assessments, consulting legal databases and HOA law precedents, and what I discovered was both deeply infuriating and grudgingly impressive from a tactical standpoint. While Vicky's action was clearly ethically questionable and morally wrong, it was technically within her legal authority as HOA president. According to the community bylaws, the governing documents included specific provisions for emergency infrastructure work, and she had managed to secure the required board signatures by skillfully framing the issue as a community safety matter that could result in serious liability if not addressed immediately. It was a brilliant piece of psychological and legal manipulation, expensive enough to cause me significant financial stress during an already difficult time, but legally defensible enough to withstand any challenge I might mount in court. That's when I made my second major mistake, one that would nearly cost me everything I had worked for and completely destroy my position in the community. Instead of taking time to find a creative solution or investing effort in building broader community support for my situation, I decided to escalate the conflict by hiring an expensive attorney and threatening to file a comprehensive lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, discrimination, and abuse of process. In my mind, given my professional background and understanding of governance law, this seemed like a completely reasonable and proportionate response to Vicky's increasingly aggressive and retaliatory behavior. In reality, it was exactly the reaction she had been hoping for and strategically maneuvering me toward. But within 24 hours of my attorney sending an official cease and desist letter to the HOA board, Vicky had managed to completely transform my public image from a problem resident into what she characterized as a dangerous community threat. She called an emergency information session for all residents where she revealed that I was allegedly a professional troublemaker who specialized in what she called scamming elderly communities for financial gain. She had somehow obtained detailed information about my consulting work and had twisted it into a sinister narrative where I supposedly made my living by systematically infiltrating peaceful communities and creating expensive legal problems for profit at the expense of honest homeowners. The character assassination campaign was swift, comprehensive, and devastatingly effective in ways I never could have anticipated. Neighbors who had been politely neutral in their interactions with me suddenly crossed the street to avoid any contact, as if I were carrying some kind of dangerous disease. Mrs. Henderson, who had always cheerfully waved from her garden when I walked by, now glared at me with open hostility, like I had personally threatened her grandchildren's safety. The mail carrier stopped bringing packages to my door and started dropping them at the curb without explanation. Even the teenage kid who mowed lawns throughout the neighborhoods stopped acknowledging my friendly waves and seemed to actively avoid my property. But the absolute worst part of this escalating nightmare wasn't the social isolation and community ostracism. It was the mounting financial pressure that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. My mother's extensive medical bills were already straining my finances to the breaking point. Her rehabilitation was progressing much more slowly than the doctors had initially hoped, and now I was facing substantial legal fees, plus a massive emergency assessment that I couldn't afford. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced what I can only describe as a complete and total panic attack. Sitting in my car outside the rehabilitation center after a particularly difficult visit with my mother, I couldn't catch my breath. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I felt like the entire world was closing in around me with no possible escape. That evening, as if she had some kind of supernatural timing, Diane appeared at my door again. This time carrying a bottle of expensive wine and a box of tissues, like she was prepared for an emotional breakdown. "I heard about the attorney," she said softly, settling onto my couch with the practiced ease of a concerned friend who had done this many times before. For Elliot, I think you really need to seriously consider that maybe Vicky has won this particular round. Sometimes the smartest and most mature thing is knowing when to fold your hand and move on to a better situation where you'll be happier. Her gentle suggestion that I should sell the house and relocate to a different community felt like complete defeat and surrender, but it also felt like the only rational and practical option that remained available to me. You could probably get a really good price for this place, Diane continued, her voice remaining gentle but becoming increasingly persistent in a way that should have raised red flags. The real estate market is incredibly strong right now, and honestly, you would probably be much happier in a community with less stringent rules and more flexible leadership. This particular neighborhood isn't the right fit for everyone, and there's absolutely no shame in admitting that and making a change. As she spoke with apparent concern for my well-being, I began to notice that she seemed unusually well-informed about my specific financial situation and remarkably eager to encourage my departure from Willowbrook Estates. The absolute breaking point came at midnight when I discovered an official-looking eviction notice that had been taped to my front door like some kind of medieval proclamation. According to the legal-sounding document, I had allegedly violated the peaceful enjoyment clause of the community covenant by engaging in what they called frivolous legal threats against the HOA and its duly leadership. The notice gave me exactly 30 days to cease all legal action and comply with all community standards or face immediate removal from the property. As I stood there in my pajamas, illuminated by the harsh glow of my porch light, and holding this completely ridiculous document, I realized with crystal clarity that Vicky had successfully maneuvered me into an impossible position where fighting back made me look unreasonable and vindictive, but not fighting back meant accepting total defeat and humiliation. For the first time in this entire escalating ordeal, I seriously considered whether Diane might actually be right about cutting my losses and moving somewhere else where I could start over without this constant harassment and stress. The eviction notice was nothing short of legal theatre at its absolute finest, complete with official-looking seals, embossed letterhead, and elaborate references to community covenant violations that sounded impressively serious but were actually completely meaningless from a legal standpoint. Vicky was clearly betting that I would either panic and immediately put my house on the market or escalate the legal battle in a way that would further damage my reputation and strengthen her position in the community. What she didn't expect was for me to do something I had learned through years of consulting work with dysfunctional organizations. When someone starts playing elaborate games with official documents and fake legal authority, the best strategy is to start methodically documenting everything they do and letting them hang themselves with their own rope. I spent the next 3 days carefully researching every single aspect of the eviction process, consulting with multiple legal experts, and analyzing the community's governing documents with the thoroughness of a law professor. What I discovered was both deeply infuriating and surprisingly encouraging for my long-term prospects. The eviction notice itself was completely invalid and legally worthless, full of procedural errors, unsupported claims, and references to authority that simply didn't exist in our community's actual governing documents. But more importantly, I began to realize that Vicky's increasingly aggressive tactics were actually clear evidence of growing desperation rather than strength. Someone who is operating from a position of legitimate authority and confidence doesn't need to resort to intimidation tactics, fake legal documents, and elaborate theatrical presentations to maintain control. That's when I made a discovery that completely changed my understanding of this entire situation and revealed the true scope of what I was dealing with. While reviewing security footage from my doorbell camera system, I noticed something extremely odd and disturbing about Diane's supposedly friendly visits to my house. During our conversations, she had been systematically taking pictures of documents on my coffee table when I stepped out of the room, photographing my mail when I wasn't looking, and even recording our private conversations on her phone without my knowledge or consent. The woman I had trusted as my only ally in this fight had actually been spying on me the entire time and reporting back to Vicky with detailed intelligence about my plans, strategies, and emotional state. Confronting Diane required extremely careful planning because I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal and gather evidence before she could warn Vicky that her spy network had been discovered. I set up a simple but effective test by deliberately leaving fake documents about my supposed plan to hire a private investigator visible on my coffee table during her next scheduled visit. Sure enough, within 6 hours of her departure, Vicky called an emergency board meeting to discuss what she dramatically termed escalating security concerns from a vindictive resident who was apparently planning to invade the privacy of law-abiding community members. When I finally confronted Diane directly with the evidence of her surveillance and betrayal, she initially tried to deny everything with the practiced innocence of someone who had been lying professionally for years. But when I showed her the clear video footage of her photographing my personal documents and recording our conversations, she completely broke down and revealed the true extent of Vicky's manipulation network with sobbing confessions. She promised to write a personal recommendation letter for my daughter's private school application. Diane admitted through her tears, her carefully maintained composure crumbling completely. Madison has been on the waiting list at Westminster Academy for 2 years, and Vicky has important connections on the admissions board. I never thought this whole thing would go this far or hurt you this badly. But Diane's tearful confession revealed something much bigger and more sinister than just personal bribery and manipulation. According to her detailed account, Vicky had been systematically targeting what she called non-compliant residents for removal as part of a much larger and more ambitious plan to sell properties throughout the neighborhood to a development company for massive personal profit. 3 other families had been forced out over the past 2 years using similar tactics of harassment and manufactured violations, and their properties had been quietly purchased by shell companies that were directly connected to Vicky's extensive real estate network and business partnerships. She calls it community improvement when she talks about it in public, Diane explained, her voice shaking with a combination of fear and guilt. But really, she's trying to systematically flip the entire neighborhood for huge profits. She's been working secretly with developers who want to tear down these older houses and build luxury condominiums that will sell for 3 times what our homes are worth. Every family she successfully forces out is another property that she can help her partners acquire below market value through intimidation and manufactured crisis. The scope and audacity of the scheme was absolutely breathtaking in its complexity and complete disregard for the community she claimed to be protecting. As if summoned by our conversation about her criminal activities, my phone buzzed with an official notification that made my blood run cold. Emergency community meeting Friday, 7:00 p.m. Final vote on problem resident actions. Vicky was calling for what she clearly intended to be my public execution, a formal vote to permanently restrict my access to all community amenities and effectively force me to sell my home under duress. But now, thanks to Diane's guilt-ridden confession, I finally understood what I was really fighting against. Not just a power-hungry HOA president with a personal vendetta, but an elaborate real estate fraud scheme that threatened the entire community. The next morning, I discovered that security cameras had been installed throughout all the common areas overnight, ostensibly for enhanced community safety, but positioned in ways that seemed specifically designed to monitor my movements and document my activities. Vicky was systematically tightening her control and preparing for what she clearly saw as her final and decisive victory in our escalating conflict. But what she didn't know was that I had spent the last 4 days quietly building a secret alliance with the other families she had targeted for removal and we were preparing to completely change the game in ways she never could have anticipated. The irony was absolutely delicious. Vicky's own surveillance cameras would soon become the primary instruments of her complete and total downfall. The days leading up to Friday's meeting felt exactly like preparation for a full-scale war. But this time, I wasn't fighting alone against overwhelming odds. Through careful and discreet outreach, I had managed to connect with Tom Bradley, a retired physician who had been quietly documenting Vicky's financial irregularities for months, and the Morrison family, who had been targeted for removal 6 months earlier, but had managed to avoid Vicky's elaborate traps through sheer stubbornness and careful documentation. Together, we had assembled a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse and corruption that went far beyond my personal situation and revealed a pattern of criminal behavior that affected the entire community. Tom had discovered through his meticulous research that Vicky had approved over $80,000 in questionable landscaping improvements to companies owned by her ex-husband, work that was either never actually completed or dramatically overpriced compared to market rates for similar services. The Morrison family had documented dozens of instances of selective rule enforcement where Vicky's political allies received gentle warnings for identical behavior, while her targets received formal violations and financial penalties. But most damning of all was the clear pattern of property acquisitions that followed each forced departure, creating an unmistakable trail of financial motivation for her harassment campaign. However, Vicky had been extremely busy too, and she had spent the entire week carefully orchestrating the meeting attendance to ensure her inevitable victory through political manipulation. Through a sophisticated combination of scheduling conflicts, subtle intimidation, and strategic misinformation about the meeting's importance, she had managed to reduce the expected attendance to exactly 15 residents, 12 of whom she counted as completely reliable supporters who would vote however she directed them. It was a masterclass in small-scale political manipulation, and under normal circumstances it would have absolutely guaranteed her success in removing me from the community. My plan was desperate, but elegantly simple in its approach: record the entire meeting and challenge its legality in real time, forcing Vicky to either follow proper procedures or expose herself as operating completely outside her legitimate authority. I had consulted extensively with my attorney about the recording laws in Georgia and confirmed that as long as one party to the conversation consented, which I obviously did, the recording would be completely admissible evidence in any future legal proceedings against her or the HOA. The meeting itself was pure political theater designed to intimidate and humiliate me in front of the community. Vicky had arranged the room exactly like a criminal courtroom, with herself positioned at the head table like a Supreme Court judge, and me, the accused, seated alone, facing the assembled residents like a defendant awaiting sentencing. She opened with an elaborate 20-minute presentation detailing my supposed pattern of defiance and ongoing threats to community harmony, complete with professional slides and printed handouts that made me look like a serial offender rather than someone who had been systematically targeted for harassment during a family medical crisis. When the formal vote was finally called, it proceeded exactly as Vicky had carefully planned and orchestrated. 12 yes votes to permanently restrict Elliot Harrington's access to community amenities pending voluntary relocation. The 3 supporting votes from Tom, the Morrisons, and one other brave soul who was willing to stand up to Vicky's intimidation were completely drowned out by her carefully assembled majority of supporters. As the gavel fell with dramatic finality, my access card was immediately deactivated, and I was coldly informed that I would need to use the rear exit since my parking privileges had been permanently revoked as well. Walking to my car through the back entrance of the community center, feeling like a criminal being escorted from the scene of my crime, I felt the full weight of complete and total defeat for the first time in this entire escalating ordeal. Vicky had outmaneuvered me at every single turn, systematically isolated me from my neighbors through her propaganda campaign, and now legally excluded me from the community I had worked so hard to call home. Sitting in my car outside the main gate, staring at the closed barrier that now represented my exile, I actually called a real estate agent to discuss the practical details of listing my house for immediate sale. The idea of giving Vicky exactly what she wanted made me physically sick to my stomach, but I honestly couldn't see any other viable path forward that wouldn't destroy me financially and emotionally. That evening, feeling more defeated than I had ever felt in my entire life, I called my mother at the rehabilitation center to tell her about my decision to surrender and sell the house. Despite her ongoing speech difficulties from the stroke, she managed to give me advice that would completely change everything. Sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war, son. Her words made me realize with sudden clarity that I had been fighting Vicky's battle on her carefully chosen terms, trying desperately to beat her at a game she had rigged from the very beginning. Instead of continuing to play by her manipulative rules, maybe it was finally time to completely change the game to my advantage. The revelation hit me like a bolt of lightning. Instead of fighting Vicky's accusations and trying desperately to prove my innocence to a community that had already been turned against me, what if I started systematically investigating her guilt and criminal behavior? All of her increasingly aggressive tactics, the rushed procedures, the financial irregularities, the manufactured emergencies, they weren't signs of strength and authority. They were clear signs of desperation and criminal behavior. Someone operating legitimately and ethically doesn't need to resort to intimidation, fake legal documents, rigged meetings, and elaborate surveillance operations to maintain control. Vicky Sterling was clearly terrified of something being discovered, and I was going to find out exactly what that something was. The next morning, I made a phone call that would change absolutely everything about this situation. Detective Chen, this is Elliot Harrington, and I need to report potential embezzlement and fraud in a homeowners association. Detective Sarah. Chen arrived at my house on Monday morning with the kind of professional skepticism and careful demeanor that comes from years of investigating white-collar crime and dealing with disgruntled residents who think every dispute is a federal case. "Mr. Harrington," she said, settling into my living room with an official notepad and a large cup of coffee. "I have to tell you honestly, we get a lot of HOA complaints that turn out to be nothing more than personality conflicts rather than actual criminal activity. What makes you think this particular situation rises to the level of genuine criminal behavior that warrants police investigation?" That's when I presented her with 3 months of carefully organized documentation, the detailed financial records that Tom had obtained through his persistent research, the comprehensive pattern analysis that the Morrison family had compiled showing systematic discrimination, photographs of the incomplete landscaping work that had been paid for with community funds, and most importantly, Deanne's signed statement, detailing Vicky's extensive bribery attempts and her admission of the property acquisition scheme. What had started as what appeared to be a simple personal dispute suddenly looked like a sophisticated fraud operation with multiple victims and substantial financial crimes. Detective Chen's entire demeanor shifted completely as she carefully reviewed the extensive evidence we had assembled. "This is significantly more organized and systematic than typical HOA corruption cases," she admitted, photographing documents and taking detailed notes about the timeline of events. "The property acquisition pattern alone suggests possible interstate commerce implications which could potentially make this a federal case rather than just a local matter. But what we really need to build a solid case is direct evidence of financial misappropriation, preferably with documentary proof or recorded admissions of criminal intent. That's when I realized with growing excitement that Vicky's own security cameras might actually be the key to her complete downfall. The surveillance systems she had installed to monitor and intimidate residents had been recording continuously for weeks, including several conversations where she had discussed her community improvement plans with various co-conspirators and business partners. With Detective Chen's help and a properly executed search warrant, we obtained legal access to review all the footage, and what we discovered exceeded our wildest expectations for evidence of criminal behavior. In one particularly damning recording that would later become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, Vicky could be clearly heard telling someone on the phone, "The Harrington situation is moving much faster than we initially expected. Once we successfully force him out, that's another property we can acquire significantly below market value. My contacts at Sterling Development are ready to move forward as soon as we clear the remaining obstacles." The conversation continued, with specific dollar amounts, detailed timelines, and explicit discussion of methods for acquiring properties through manufactured violations and harassment campaigns that left absolutely no doubt about her criminal intent and systematic fraud. But the real breakthrough that sealed Vicky's fate came when Detective Chen discovered through forensic accounting that Vicky had been systematically using HOA funds to pay personal legal fees, credit card bills, and even her daughter's college tuition at an expensive private university. The financial trail was extensive and poorly hidden, suggesting that Vicky had become increasingly careless and arrogant as her scheme expanded and she believed herself untouchable. In total, she had misappropriated over $120,000 from community funds over the past 3 years, money that should have been used for legitimate community improvements and maintenance. As news of the criminal investigation began to spread throughout the community, Vicky's carefully constructed support network started to crumble like a house of cards in a strong wind. Residents who had supported her out of fear, misinformation, or personal benefits began coming forward with their own stories of intimidation and manipulation. The Morrison family revealed that Vicky had threatened to have their teenage son arrested for criminal trespassing when he had used the community pool during what she claimed were restricted hours, despite the restriction being a rule she had invented specifically to target their family for harassment. Diane's confession proved to be the catalyst for several other residents to finally admit they had been pressured into supporting Vicky through various forms of bribery, threats, or promises of special treatment. Mrs. Patterson revealed that Vicky had promised to overlook her garden gnome violations, which technically violated the community aesthetic standards, in exchange for her continued loyalty and support. Mr. Williams admitted that he had voted against his conscience because Vicky had threatened to report his legitimate home-based business to county zoning officials who could shut him down. The community that had seemed so unified against me just days earlier was now revealing itself to be a collection of intimidated residents who had been too afraid, isolated, or compromised to resist Vicky's increasingly authoritarian rule. Detective Chen noted that this pattern of coercion, manipulation, and systematic intimidation was entirely typical of white-collar criminals who used their positions of authority to create an atmosphere of fear and compliance that prevented victims from speaking out or seeking help. As Detective Chen prepared the arrest warrant with the district attorney's office, she warned me that Vicky would likely become more desperate and unpredictable once she realized that the criminal investigation was underway and closing in on her. White collar criminals often double down when they're cornered, she explained, with the voice of experience. They convince themselves that one more aggressive move will solve all their problems and make the evidence disappear. Be prepared for her to try something dramatic and potentially dangerous. The detective's warning proved to be remarkably prophetic when I returned home that evening to find Vicky waiting at the community gate with 2 private security guards, clearly preparing for what she saw as her final and decisive confrontation. The irony was absolutely perfect. She was about to hang herself with her own rope, and I was going to document every single minute of it for the criminal trial that would follow. Tuesday morning brought the kind of dramatic confrontation that Vicky Sterling had been building toward for months. Except this time, she had absolutely no idea that Detective Chen was parked just around the corner in an unmarked vehicle, watching everything unfold in real time through the very security cameras that Vicky had installed to spy on residents and document their activities. I approached the main gate at exactly 7:30 in the morning, knowing with complete certainty that Vicky would be waiting there with whatever dramatic gesture she had planned as her final and decisive power play in our escalating conflict. Sure enough, Vicky stood at the entrance with two intimidating private security guards flanking her like she was protecting a high-security military installation rather than a suburban neighborhood entrance. "Mr. Harrington," she announced, loudly enough for the gathering crowd of curious residents to hear every word. "You are permanently and irrevocably banned from these premises. Any attempt to enter will result in immediate arrest for criminal trespassing and violation of community standards." She had clearly prepared and rehearsed this speech extensively, and her delivery had the theatrical flair and dramatic timing of someone who genuinely believed she was delivering a decisive victory that would end our conflict once and for all. "Mrs. Sterling," I replied, as calmly as I could manage, pulling out my phone to record the entire interaction for legal evidence. "I am a property owner here with full legal right of access to my home and the common areas. Unless you have a valid court order or some other form of legitimate legal authority, you cannot prevent me from entering my own neighborhood." My response was carefully measured and reasonable, specifically designed to contrast sharply with her increasingly aggressive and irrational behavior for the recording and the witnesses. That's when Vicky made her absolutely fatal mistake that would seal her fate in the criminal trial. In her desperation to maintain control and assert her authority, she began ranting about her absolute authority as HOA president and her legal responsibility to protect the community from troublemakers and criminals. But more importantly, for the prosecution's case, she started openly admitting to actions that were clearly outside her legal authority and constituted criminal behavior. "I've used community funds for necessary expenses to address direct threats like you. Every single dollar spent was completely justified to maintain community standards and protect property values from people who want to destroy what we've built here." Detective Chen chose that absolutely perfect moment to announce her presence and begin the arrest process. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm Detective Chen with the County Police Department. I'd like to speak with you about some serious financial irregularities we've discovered in the HOA accounts." The timing was absolutely cinematic in its perfection, and the look of complete shock and panic that spread across Vicky's face was worth every moment of harassment and humiliation I had endured over the past 3 months of this escalating nightmare. What followed was a complete psychological meltdown that revealed the true extent of Vicky's delusions and her complete disconnection from reality. "You can't do this to me," she screamed at Detective Chen, her carefully maintained composure and professional demeanor finally cracking completely. "I built this community from nothing. I maintained property values. I protected these people from undesirable elements and criminals." She gestured wildly at me with genuine hatred, as if I were some kind of existential threat to civilization, rather than a homeowner who had been caring for his sick mother during a medical crisis. The irony reached its absolute peak when Detective Chen informed Vicky that she was under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty, all while standing directly in front of the security cameras she had installed to intimidate residents and gather evidence against her enemies. "You have the right to remain silent." Detective Chen began reading the Miranda rights, but Vicky continued her increasingly unhinged rant even as the handcuffs were applied, providing even more evidence of her complete mental breakdown and admission of guilt. As Vicky was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence and demanding to know who had betrayed her and destroyed everything she had worked for, the assembled residents finally began to understand the true scope of what had been happening in their community for years. Tom Bradley immediately called for an emergency HOA meeting to remove Vicky from all positions and begin the complex process of financial recovery and comprehensive governance reform. The aftermath was swift, thorough, and absolutely satisfying, in ways I never could have imagined. Within 1 week, Vicky had been unanimously removed from all HOA positions, and Tom Bradley was elected as interim president with a clear mandate to restore transparency, accountability, and basic human decency to community governance. Diane Peterson publicly apologized to the entire community and to me personally, revealing the full extent of Vicky's manipulation network and agreeing to testify as a key witness in any criminal proceedings. The financial recovery process took considerably longer, but ultimately Vicky was ordered to pay full restitution of $137,000 plus substantial penalties and interest that would follow her for years. Her sentencing hearing 3 months later resulted in 3 years in federal prison and 5 years of probation, during which she was legally prohibited from serving in any fiduciary capacity or position of authority over community funds. The judge specifically noted that her systematic abuse of authority and targeting of residents represented a particularly egregious breach of community trust that warranted significant punishment. 6 months after my ordeal began, I received a handwritten letter from new residents thanking me for cleaning up the neighborhood and making Willowbrook Estates the kind of community they had hoped to join when they decided to move here. My mother had recovered enough to move into an excellent assisted living facility nearby, where she enjoyed telling the other residents about her son, who took down the neighborhood dictator. And most satisfying of all, the community had implemented comprehensive new governance procedures that would prevent any future Vicky Sterling from turning our peaceful neighborhood into her personal kingdom. The best revenge, as it turned out, wasn't getting even with Vicky Sterling through some elaborate scheme of my own. It was simply watching her destroy herself through her own arrogance, greed, and complete inability to control her criminal impulses while building something infinitely better from the wreckage she left behind. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when facing a bully is simply to document their behavior carefully and let them hang themselves with their own rope. And if you're dealing with your own power-hungry HOA president, remember this: stay calm, document absolutely everything, and never underestimate the power of patience and persistence, because eventually every tyrant makes the mistake that brings them down, and when they do, justice tastes sweeter than any revenge you could have planned. Like, comment, and subscribe for your weekly dose of mayhem.